Welcome back to Education Matters. We're going to continue our discussion today on criminal justice and schools with Peggy Nicholson. Peggy is the co-director of the Youth Justice Project. You are an attorney. And I mentioned in my brief intro, the Youth Justice Project, a statewide organization. You're based in Durham, and you focus on fair and effective school discipline practices as well as reforms in the criminal and the juvenile justice system. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Why does the Youth Justice Project believe that there is a need to focus on school discipline, like how young people interact with the criminal justice system? Why do you think we need to focus on it?
Right. So I think there are lots of reasons people should care about the use of suspensions and the overuse of suspensions in North Carolina. The first is really anytime a child is suspended, they're out of the class. They're missing critical instruction time. Another reason that it's really important to look at suspensions is because we've been using them for years, but they don't work. There's no research or data showing that suspension actually deters misbehavior, addresses the root cause of student misbehavior, just putting the child out, and then they come back to the class with all those same problems and behaviors. Finally, suspensions aren't distributed equally. And looking at the numbers of suspensions, who gets those suspensions, we know that students of color, Black students especially, and students with disabilities are disproportionately given suspensions across the state of North Carolina. And so it's really an issue of potential discrimination that when we're looking at suspension.
Right. You know, you saw the interview we did with DA-elect DeBerry, and she mentioned the criminal justice system being a blunt object.
Right.
I mean, school discipline can be too. When you have, right? I mean, so I think that's what you're referring to. Is you want to maintain order in the class. You want to make sure it's a good learning environment, but it's like, get them out of the class, get them suspended, and then they're excluded from. I mean, and that's what you're really getting at.
Right. Nobody advocates for no accountability for student misbehavior. It's more looking what does evidence and research show us is going to be effective, what is actually going to bring that student back into the classroom ready to learn, allow their peers to learn, and make an overall better school climate.
Now, I mentioned the school to prison pipeline. Why do you think it's called that?
Yeah, so I think that it's really important to look at what schools do to either exacerbate this pipeline and push students towards the court system, and in some cases, what schools are doing to really dismantle that pipeline and take students who are really high needs and help make sure they don't end up in the court system. I think schools have a lot of agency in this conversation, so I know the school to prison pipeline is sometimes a controversial term, but I do think there is a lot that schools can do to dismantle this push towards the court system that many students experience.
Well, and I mean, you've got some data on your website, but there's real data that when students are suspended, particularly talking about high school students,
right,
then they're out, they're not being supervised.
Absolutely.
They're probably not around, they may not be around any parents or caregivers, and they actually are more likely to end up, I mean, I saw some pretty crazy numbers about every time you get suspended, the more likely you are to end up being incarcerated as an adult.
Right, and you know, that happens very directly when you have police in schools. So sometimes a suspension can result in interaction with the court system because the student's out of school. Sometimes the court system, through law enforcement, is there in the school directly putting kids into that court system. Right.
We talked a little bit about, in the first part, about race equity. That's something that I know your organization, in fact, I encourage our viewers to check out your website, youthjusticenc.org, and you can find us on our website too. You produce an annual racial equity report card. What are you tracking?
So there's lots of data available on schools, right? And often that data is presented to the public in kind of overall numbers for school. You know, we give each school a grade. And our organization thought it was really important to break that data out by subgroups, look at how different racial groups are performing, because what may be an A school overall, really for Black students is a C school. They're not getting the same opportunities, or they're experiencing higher levels of suspension. And so we wanted to make sure that information was out there as well, because that's an important conversation that schools and communities need to be having. Are all students getting the same education, the same discipline? And overall, our findings are they're not. And so we really want to empower communities to start working on that and finding solutions.
Yeah, and maybe I like to be optimistic about these things. When I talk to groups and we share this data, they're shocked that some of the disparities that exist.
Yeah, I mean, it's because that data is not really easily available for the public. I will say that when we go and speak with groups, especially of parents of Black students, they're usually not shocked.
I was going to say,
yeah.
when I talk to other groups and share like that, Black students are suspended 40% more than white students, often for the same offenses.
Right.
The Black parents in the audience are nodding. Of course, yeah, we know that, but it's the other parents that just don't know.
Right. It really validates their experience because they're seeing it, and students see it too. We work with a lot of students who are involved in the court system or have been involved with exclusionary discipline like suspension, and it's not telling them anything new. It's just providing data to back it up.
Right. Now, you're doing this work at the Youth Justice Project at the same time that we are seeing an increase in school shootings. I mean, mass shootings, but also violence inside of school, like what we had at a high school outside of Charlotte recently. Now, a lot of policymakers, a lot of parents are actually calling for more security, more police in schools. I mean, they're scared.
Right.
They want to do something. So I'm going to ask you more or less the same question that I asked DA-elect DeBerry. I mean, how would you respond to those who say we actually need to be tougher?
Yeah.
That we don't need to sort of step back from enforcement.
I think the safety of students and school staff is critically important. The problem is that we don't have any research or data showing that increasing the number of police in schools makes them safer. First, there's not a lot of data on it, but the studies that have been conducted don't show an increase in school safety or overall positive school climate. We do know that there are things that work: increasing support staff, having more smaller class sizes, more counselors, more social workers, more of those trained professional adults who can provide early interventions and supports for students. So I think that when policymakers are looking at where do we want to spend resources, one, they need to really examine how effective these school resource officers are being, especially given the potential negative impacts. And two, until we know that they're actually effective, put our money into the things we know works. It's all about what is going to actually have a positive impact on school safety. So I think when we're talking about school safety, we really have to question some of the assumptions we've been making.
Well, speaking of things that are working, you told me that your group is working with some school districts on what you're calling school justice partnerships.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about that.
So that's a really exciting initiative that is really kind of community driven. So it started in Georgia with a juvenile court judge who saw these cases coming into his courtroom that shouldn't be there. And so he was dismissing them, but eventually he said, I want to pull everyone together all at the same table: law enforcement, school folks, community service providers, and figure out how we can reduce school-based referrals. And they came up with an agreement that really did three things. One, it reduced, it really set clear guidelines for what types of offenses school resource officers should be involved in, and took minor offenses kind of off the table as criminal offenses. It also provided lots of training for different folks, and also data collection and monitoring of the SRO program. And they had great results. They significantly reduced juvenile court complaints coming out of school. They didn't see any negative impacts on academic achievement or overall school safety. And that model was then picked up by some North Carolina districts in New Hanover and Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and they saw similar success. And so now, statewide in North Carolina, judges are really being encouraged to do that same kind of community convening in their local district, bring people to the table and see what their community can do to reduce the school-based offenses.
So just quick last word. I mean, so what would you want viewers to take away? I mean, there are other ways to, I guess, another way to do it.
Yeah, there are lots of collaborative, individualized ways that at a local level you can look at school-based offenses. I think Attorney DeBerry is going to hopefully be doing that work in Durham soon.
Great. Well, look, thanks so much for being on the show today. I think it's an important topic, and we wanted to bring it to our viewers to sort of start another conversation. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
After the break, this week's final word.